Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Next, I would like to talk to you about the history of cultural anthropology, and I'm going to condense what is obviously a very long and expansive topic into a very brief lecture. It's important for you to understand something about the history of cultural anthropology in order to understand what it is today, what it is that cultural anthropologists do today. So let's go back in time to the 1800s. The academic discipline of anthropology doesn't really begin until the very end of the 1800s. But throughout the 1800s, and of course, even before that, humans were concerned with trying to understand where it is that humanity came from, humanity's origins, and relatedly, why it is that humans look so different from one another. I should note that because this particular unit looks at the history of anthropology. We will also be touching on topics that deal with racist histories, images, and discourse. So again, that is because people tried to kind of started to pose this question, particularly during the age of exploration, is that you had people from all over the world, not just Europeans, but also in particular Europeans, going out to various parts of the world to colonize them for various economic and political reasons. So scholars, scientists try to come up with theories and methods to explain, right, again, how it is that people can come to even though we're all humans, how is it that we can all look so different from one another? And why is that the case? And where is it that humans in general come from? So this would lead to the field of phrenology, which, as I've noted here, is a detailed study of the shape and size of the cranium as a supposed indication of character and mental abilities. In other words, they believed that you could, in studying the size of one's skull and the shape of one's skull, that could tell you something about an individual's personality or the characteristics of a particular human population. And so phrenology became a hobby of sorts for medical doctors and naturalists. I'd just like to note once again that terms like phrenology that are highlighted are going to be especially important for you to know in this course. So here's an example of, straight out of a, historical text. This is what the phrenologist would sort of argue, right? That look, from simply looking at the shape of this woman's skull, we can tell whether or not she will be a good mother, or whether that she will be, quote, the unmotherly, unquote. So you can tell here by my tone that I'm very critical of phrenology. That's because it's not real science. It's a pseudoscience, right? It was not based on rigorous scientific fact. Also note that at this time, anthropologists did not do field work, right? In the case of phrenology, right, you had scholars who would go out and, say, measure people's skulls. Let's take for the example of Franz Boas. He would study the skulls of immigrant populations. We'll come back to that later. But generally speaking, anthropologists who would write texts about other cultures, cultural anthropologists, didn't leave their homes at this time period because they weren't real cultural anthropologists. They were essentially hobbyists, right? They were kind of self-described anthropologists who really relied on secondhand information, and this is why we call them armchair anthropologists. They didn't even leave their armchairs, right? This included colonial officials who didn't actually directly live in villages among the people they quote-unquote studied, right? Instead, they're reading the texts and diaries of missionaries and explorers, people who did go to those places. What's important to note here is in this very early formulation of anthropology, before it was really even anthropology, this fledgling discipline was clearly very supportive of white supremacist ideals in the United States. Right? In other words, they kept finding that, it just so happens that the most advanced person or the best characteristics tend to be in people who had skulls shaped like or the size of their European populations, right? Western European populations. So racial ideas of racial inferiority and social evolution were not new at that time. They'd already been around. But what was new is the idea that they were taken up by scientific discourse, precisely in this time period when modern science is still relatively novel. It's a fledgling phenomenon. We'll talk about Darwin in a moment. But it was gathering and garnering increased attention and respect, broadly speaking. Okay, so the next two terms that you will need to know, and these terms can be used interchangeably, are cultural evolutionism and classical social evolutionary theory. These are terms that you will need to know for this course. Again, cultural evolutionism or classical social evolutionary theory. They both mean the same thing. Both of these terms are ethnocentric. Do you remember what ethnocentric means? If not, I encourage you to pause the video and go through your notes. Try to find where we talked about ethnocentrism previously. So, according to cultural evolutionism, which was forged by the early anthropologists E.B. Tylor and Lewis Henry Morgan. In fact, E.B. Tylor is often called the grandfather of anthropology. Cultural evolutionism is this idea that all cultures go through a fixed sequence of evolutionary stages. In other words, it's unilineal, meaning that it only goes in one direction, from simple bands of hunter-gatherers to more complex civilizations. Okay. Lewis Henry Morgan, who studied Iroquois societies in upstate New York, argued that technological advancement represented societal advancement. Right. In other words, that he charted how Iroquois peoples across different time periods and different groups of them, how it is that they used and created different forms of technology. And so, simple technology meant a sort of simpler society or simpler culture, and vice versa, more complex technology meant something different. He was actually not an armchair anthropologist. Lewis Henry Morgan worked actively with Iroquois communities. He had an Iroquois research assistant, and he really he conducted a lot of field work with these communities and tried to show the complex kinship or family system that Iroquois communities lived in. It's important to know that this is an ethnocentric idea, that cultural anthropologists nowadays do not believe or agree with this idea of cultural evolutionism or classical social evolutionary theory. Why is that? Why do you think that would be? Well, there's an implicit bias, a racist bias kind of embedded in the theory. For example, why assume that a culture is more or less advanced simply because of the kind of technology it uses? I will continue that argument in the next section.